Year 10 and 11, welcome to your analysis of Remains by Simon Armitage in preparation for your English Literature poetry exam. The poem. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us opened fire, three of a kind all letting fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story. Except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street and out on patrol. I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave. But I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. And the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under his desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his blood life in my bloody hands. The first question we've got to ask ourselves then is, what is the poem about? If you make a note, obviously do so. Sometimes I talk quite fast, so I apologise for that, and you will have to put up with my accent. So, the poem Remains. The poem is an anecdote. Okay, so the poem is told anecdotally and begins with on another occasion, implying that this account is not the only unpleasant thing that the soldier has in his memory or remembers. He tells how he and somebody else opened fire on a looter who may or may not have been armed. That's important for us. They shot him dead, and one of them puts the man's guts back in his body before he's carted away. Later, the soldier thinks about the shooting every time he walks down the street. Then later again, when he returns home, he is still haunted by the thought of what he's done. He tries drink and drugs to drown out the memory, but they don't work. The line, he's here in my head when I close my eyes, shows us that he can't forget what he's done or the memory of what he's done. And the final lines of the poem show that the memory was not left behind in the place of war or in a distant land, but is with the speaker all of the time. He feels as though he will always have blood on his hands. He feels as though he is very guilty. All right, so if you need to obviously take notes on this slide, then obviously just pause the video and make the notes that you need. The structure of the poem. Remains is formed in 8 stanzas, and the first 7 stanzas are in largely unrhymed quatrains. Now, if we look at that closely, it mirrors natural speech and it adds a fast-paced rhythm to the poem, which suits the idea that it's anecdotal. And remember, the poem is also a monologue. So this fast-paced, almost conversation-like quatrain shows us that the guy is almost telling us a story of what happened. And I think it's also the idea that he's a little bit panicked, isn't he, because of what he's done and how haunted he is. And the quatrain linked to enjambment makes the pace fast and furious, and he's unable to stop. And the reader, we're thrown into the mix, if you like, in terms of having to listen to what he's done and bear witness to his guilt. The final stanza is only 2 lines long and stands out from the rest of the poem. And the reason for that is it hugely emphasises the fact that the speaker can't get rid of the memory of this killing. Yes, you could imply that it's the disintegration of the speaker's mind, but it stands out, doesn't it, because he can't forget what he's done and he feels so guilty about it, which is why you've got a shorter stanza at the end. The title Remains can refer to a couple of things depending on your interpretation of the poem. It can refer to the remains of the dead man, because remember we get that line about how his guts are outside of his body. It can refer to the remains of the memory that haunts the speaker, or to what remains of his life now that he is plagued with guilt. So actually the title has a few different meanings. And remember, poetry is about interpretation, so interpret it as you like. But I do, sometimes a grade 8 and a grade 9, which would be your A and your A star grade, might include all three interpretations, okay? As I said earlier, the poem is a monologue, so we get the point of view of the speaker, and this is emotive and harsh because it's a first-person account of what happened. It's somebody admitting to what they've done, and the circumstances of what he's done are harrowing, aren't they? That he's admitting to opening fire on someone that might actually be innocent. So the monologue again provides the poem with an honesty that the reader can't avoid. As I said earlier about the quatrain, the poem has a fast-paced natural speech to it, and this links in with enjambment between stanzas. And as I say, it's as if someone's telling you a story. It's natural speech. And you could argue it's as if he doesn't want to stop telling you what he's done. He wants to get like a confession. You could argue that the quatrain and the enjambment acts as a confession because he wants to almost tell someone his story. And finally, the first 4 stanzas describe the shooting, while the second half of the poem describes the after effects of the action on the speaker. So just to reiterate that your main terms for structure are: it's a monologue, it uses free verse, and it uses enjambment. All right, so a monologue, as I say, the speaker's point of view. Free verse, it doesn't rhyme, and the enjambment of the run-on lines. If we analyse language now, and we'll go stanza by stanza, as you'll see from my other videos if you've seen them. So stanza 1. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. I already mentioned on another occasion, and that implies it's not the first time, and that this is not the only unpleasant encounter that the soldier has had. It's as if he's had quite a few unpleasant stories to tell, and this is just one of them. We got sent out, inclusive pronoun we. It's that idea of the collective comrades in the army and the brotherhood that they share, because remember there's 3 of them, isn't there, that open fire. So the inclusive pronoun is this camaraderie that the army men have, and that they look after one another, and that they're in it together, if you like. To tackle looters raiding a bank, one of them legs it up the road. Legs it up the road is colloquial. I'll mention that later on, but it is colloquial language. If you can't spell colloquial, it's COLLOQUIAL. So, probably armed, possibly not. The speaker in the poem is haunted by the guilt of taking another man's life. He is upset by the fact that the man might be innocent. This phrase is so important, guys, that it is repeated later on in the poem, emphasising the speaker's sense of discomfort at having killed another human who may be innocent. Okay, so probably armed and possibly not is really important. In stanza 2, we've got the phrase that they're all of the same mind, and I've put it on this slide here just to explain. The phrase all of the same mind shows that the army men respond to the looter in the same way, and that therefore links to the inclusive pronoun we. Okay, so we're all of the same mind links to the inclusive pronoun we, because again it's this camaraderie, the idea that they are trained and in the same way, to react in the same way. So this suggests that they have been trained, and their act of opening fire is one that is programmed into them. They do not behave as individuals, but rather as a collective. Okay, again, don't forget to pause the video if you do want to make some of my notes. I do have a tendency to talk faster than I realise. On to stanza 2. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all 3 of us open fire, 3 of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear. The phrase are all of the same mind are just analysed, so make sure that you take note of that off the other slide. The repetition of somebody else and somebody else implies that the soldiers and the men are interchangeable and that they have almost lost their identity, which links to all of the same mind. Again, as a reader, that's quite a harrowing thought that they don't have their own identity and that they are interchangeable. And I think that this is just interpretation. I may be totally wrong. I think that subtly there, Simon Armitage might be hinting on at soldiers in the army, as if people treat them as if they're interchangeable, as if they're just a number that protect the country, rather than individual men with their own identity. Three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear. Letting fly is metaphorical, obviously, because it's the description of the bullets as they leave the gun. I swear. We've all used that word, haven't we? And it's because the speaker here, the soldier, is desperate for us to take his word and description of the bullets and gunfire. He wants us to believe what he's saying, and we do, because he's confessing to shooting somebody and he gives us graphic detail about it, so we do believe what he says. Perhaps he's so desperate for us to listen to him because he wants to rid himself of the burden of this guilt, and by sharing it with someone he feels that might happen. On to stanza 3. I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. So the metaphor, I see every round as it rips through his life, is the destruction of the man and the life that he has. Rips is uncomfortable, isn't it? It's an uncomfortable word. It's uncomfortable imagery because it's a body that is being ripped apart by guns. It is uncomfortable for the reader. It's graphic. It is, as I say, it is a confession, and he spares no detail. I see broad daylight on the other side. It's very matter of fact. There's no emotion there. It's emotionless. It's a straightforward statement that when they shoot him, they can see through him, because as in the first line says, they have ripped through his life. Again, quite a disturbing image for the reader. As I say, it's a monologue. He's confessing. There's no emotion here, and that in turn disturbs us. The loot is killed by rounds of bullets that the group of soldiers shoot, obviously, and they can see through them. I've said that. Life for the loot is instantly and brutally ended. The way the speaker sees broad daylight on the other side suggests the speed with which everything happens. 1 minute there is a man who was alive, and the next nothing. Obviously, make sure you get those notes there, because there's quite a few. He's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Sort of inside out. Sort of, again, is colloquial. It's natural speech. Remember, as I said earlier, with the enjambment and the quatrains and the colloquial language in stanza 1 and the colloquial language here, sort of, it's supposed to represent natural speech, and that's where the poem takes on a realistic tone, and sort of implies that it is difficult for the soldier to describe. Naturally, I don't think we could describe seeing someone's guts. Inside out actually tells us that his guts are hanging out. Again, that phrase is uncomfortable for the reader. Stanza 4. Pain itself, the image of agony, one of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. Right, so this line, pain itself, leads on from stanza 3 through the use of enjambment, which I mentioned in structure at the beginning. Emotive language of pain and agony represent the fact that the looter is dead. And obviously we can try to imagine that being shot with a lot of rounds is painful. So we've got this emotional language, and it's the first time we've had emotive language, isn't it? Because when he's described the shooting, as I said, it's very matter of fact. It's a description of what happened with no emotion. Now we start to get emotive language because we realise that actually the soldier really does feel guilty. One of my mates, again, colloquial language. So there's the word colloquial I was spelling earlier. He uses colloquial phrases all the way through because it is a mirror image of natural speech. Tosses his guts back into his body. It highlights the bond that they have, that they've created because of situations like this. Remember, they've been in a war zone together, so they act. They don't need to speak to one another, they all act because they've been trained to. The colloquial term mate as well suggests friendship and an understanding between the soldiers of the brutal reality that they have faced together at war. So at the start of the poem we had that they're all of the same mind, three of a kind. Now we get mate. Again, it's this interchangeable idea of the soldiers not having an identity, but that the camaraderie of them being friends and looking after and supporting and protecting one another. You could argue it's gone too far here because remember, we don't know if the looter is actually innocent. The soldiers have a disregard for human life. Now, this is probably due to a war zone, obviously, where they've witnessed death and had to kill others. So the word tosses implies carelessness, as if the loot is worthless. My mate goes by and tosses his guts back into his body, as if they're tossing a piece of rubbish. Okay, so the soldiers have a disregard for human life. As I said earlier, please pause the video if you do need to make notes. I can feel myself starting to talk quickly. I apologise. The last line of that stanza, he's carted off in the back of a lorry. Again, disregard for human life. It sounds like he's an animal, doesn't it? He's carted off in the back of a lorry. That's a person. That's a person that's just been shot. And as we know, the most disturbing thing about the poem is we don't know if he was actually armed in the first place. Okay. And stanza 5, end of story, except not really. The story he is told haunts him, and that's why it lasts, and that's why it's not the end of the story, because he can't forget what he's done. I think that implies to the war as well. He can't forget what he's done. His blood shadow stays on the street and out on patrol. I walk over it week after week. So his blood shadow stays on the street and out on patrol is a metaphor of the guilt, isn't it? This blood shadow that follows him everywhere he goes, it's guilt, and it lingers like a shadow, and it follows him everywhere. And week after week proves that he can't forget what he's done. Then I'm home on leave. Home is an emotive term. It's where we look for safety. It's where we go for safety. And unfortunately, he doesn't have that, because even when he goes home, he is haunted by the memory of this. And I do think of war as well. I walk right over it. You could argue it's him trying to get over it and move on, but as we know, he can't. And but I blink leads us into, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. And the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. Bursts again through the doors of the bank is the memory of what's happened. Sleep is an isolated word in the sentence. He is dreaming about what happened, but it is a nightmare about whether or not he was armed. And the speaker can't remember, emphasising his discomfort at having killed a human being who could have been innocent. Then we get another isolated word underneath, which is dream. I definitely believe in terms of structure, and these two isolated words, your grade 8 and your grade 9, your A and your A star would mention them, because by having them isolated on their own, it's Simon Armitage's structure. So dream is isolated. He dreams of the looter being torn apart. Again, uncomfortable phrase, showing the vulnerability of the looter in the face of the trained soldier. I also think it's twofold in the sense that it's the vulnerability of the soldier because of his training, because of what he's witnessed, because of what he's experienced. Okay? If we move on to the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. Again, it's metaphorical. So he tries to use drink and drugs to rid himself of the memories of war and this particular incident, but he can't. Flush him out reminds us of a detox. Remember, a detox is getting all of the bad toxins out of our body. And for him, the bad toxin, if you like, is this memory. So the metaphor of flush him out is a detox. He wants to remove the toxins and the bad memories from his system. And as we know by the end of the poem, which we'll look at in a minute, he absolutely can't. Okay, so like, a detox, it's not like he's ate a pizza and he needs to go on a healthy diet. I know that sounds silly, but he's shot someone, okay? So the detox, if you like, or the drink and the drugs is futile, isn't it? It's totally pointless because he cannot forget what he's done. Stanza 7. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand. So it's conflict, isn't it? The speaker is acting under orders and is engaged in combat in another country. So he's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. The physical description of the place is dry and dusty, reminding the reader of images, scenes of war. So the description of the place, sun-stunned, sand-smothered, it's distant. It's almost as if this shooting is interchangeable with the war zone he's been in. Almost as if he always feels like he's in a war zone, always feels like there's some sort of conflict. So and he sees it when he closes his eyes, behind enemy lines. It's an army military phrase, isn't it? He's here in my head when I close my eyes, proves that he can't forget. Not left for dead. So then, again, interpretation, does that mean the people he leaves for dead in other countries, he can forget? Whereas the one he shot on home soil, he can't? Again, that's just a question for you to think about in terms of interpretation. So the implication is that he can forget killing men who are the enemy in a war zone, but not the looter. So as a reader, you need to think about human life here and the value of human life. So the last stanza is only 2 lines, as I mentioned in the structure bit. But near to the knuckle here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Colloquial phrase of bloody life, it's a play on words, taking into account the bloodshed that has occurred, isn't it? Because remember, we know that the guy was ripped apart by bullets, that you could see through him, and that his guts were hanging out, so it's certainly going to be a bloody scene. Bloody hands refers to the guilt, that he can't get rid of it. He can't forget what he's done, but actually it is a reference to Macbeth. So if you have not read Macbeth, it's best that you read this bit here and make a note. So the language alludes to Shakespeare's play Macbeth with its reference to sleep and bloody hands. When Macbeth murders his king, he says, Macbeth doth murder sleep. And similarly, the speaker refers to his disturbed sleep after killing the looter. The poem ends with the image of his bloody hands, which reminds us of Lady Macbeth's struggles to remove the spot of blood that represents her guilt. Again, pause this here if you do need to make a note, especially if you haven't studied Macbeth before, just to get that reference about the bloody hands. So summing up of language then, the language in the poem is anecdotal. Please check your spelling on that. Which along with the pace and rhythm, so the quatrains and the free verse and the enjambment, gives the sense that the speaker is directly telling us his story. Slang and colloquial language is used, such as mates and legs it. We already discussed that it's supposed to be a mirror image of natural speech. The speaker shifts from the past tense in the first 2 lines to the present tense, which adds immediacy to the narrative. Guys, your grade 8 and your grade 9, your A and A star answer will be able to reference that. So I'll say it again. The speaker shifts from the past tense to the present tense. Now, that again shows us that the events are unforgettable. Okay, so please make a note of that. Imagery. The imagery in the poem is graphic and brutal in its description of the killing. We hear about the guts hanging out. The bullets rip through the man's body and his guts are hanging outside of him, yeah? The poet does not spare the reader the details of the shooting, especially when he says that his mate tosses his guts back into his body. This conveys the disturbance and the trauma that soldiers carry home with them after being in war. That is why we get the graphic description, to show us what they have to bring home with them when they finish their duties. Okay, I hope this video has been useful. If you do need to go back and pause it and make notes, feel free. If you need any more of my videos, if you just type my name into YouTube, all the poetry revision for EdXL and AQA, Inspector Calls, Frankenstein, the poetry of Mice and Men and Animal Farm, you'll find a lot there. If you just type in my name, which is Stacey Reay, that's Stacey, and Reay is Reay. I hope the videos are useful, and good luck in your English literature exam.